Welcome to Microcollege, a podcast exploring innovative, place-based, and humanly scaled responses to the crises in higher education, meaning, and discourse in our time. Everyone knows that colleges and universities are at a breaking point, but what can be done? I'm Jacob Hunt, the director of Thoreau College, a microcollege in Viroqua, Wisconsin. Join us each week as we tackle this question head-on. Welcome to Microcollege. Today, we are honored to have as a guest Austin Smith, who is a new resident here in southwestern Wisconsin in the Viroqua area. He comes to us most recently via the way of Stanford University, which is always an interesting connection to here in our small town of Wisconsin. Austin is a poet, grew up on a farm, and Austin, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself. Tell us your story a bit.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Jacob. I really appreciate it. I grew up on a dairy farm in northwestern Illinois. We had a small family dairy farm there, had been in our family for several generations. And interestingly enough, my dad is also a poet. So I kind of grew up with a love for poetry as well as a love for the culture of the small family dairy farm there in Illinois. My family had to sell our farm in about 2008, and my parents now live in southwestern Wisconsin, and that's one of the reasons that I landed in Viroqua, to be closer to my family.
Cool. Yeah, the poetry and dairy farming, right? There's farming is I think that's a special connection, right? So yeah, who are some of your inspirations as a poet?
So yeah, when I was growing up, my dad was very influenced as a poet himself by writers such as Wendell Berry, Gary Snyder, poets and writers in that milieu. In fact, my dad had the opportunity when I was just about 12 years old to meet the poet Gary Snyder. Wow. He came and visited my dad on the dairy farm. So it was a really formative time for a young poet. I knew I wanted to write poems from the time I was a little kid. A funny story I tell is that I had a poetry notebook. I was very precocious. I spelled poetry Poetrey, so I added an extra E there. But I basically wanted to be a poet just from a very, very young age, and I was lucky to have very supportive parents. And then as I matured as a young poet, in writing mostly about my experience growing up on the farm, those same writers who influenced my dad were certainly influential for me, and I continue to be influenced by the work of Wendell Berry to the point where my dog's name is Wendell. Gary Snyder has been very important to me. Midwestern writers and poets have been very influential for me, and my dad himself has been a very, very strong influence in my own work.
Cool. Yeah. Wendell Berry, hopefully most of our readers or our listeners have heard of Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry, Gary Snyder, these are really important figures in the culture, people that people should know about. But I think this the marriage of farming, agriculture, the practical kind of natural world and language is part of our heritage here as Thoreau was a great example of a practitioner of this kind of thing. Henry David Thoreau, the American Transcendentalists, and this is certainly part of woven into the curriculum of Thoreau College, right? This combination of things you do with your hands, interactions with living things, plants and the animals, and tools, things like this are things to make language with, right?
That's really an interesting point, and I think often about the origin of the word verse, which is the turn at the end of a furrow. So when I was reading and writing poems, even as a little kid, it's a little strange, but I always had the image of a poem as looking almost like an open field. Mm. And so I think of poetry as a kind of agriculture. You're not to belabor the metaphor, but you're planting language and it's hopefully being reaped by the reader. And my dad and I both kind of think about poetry and farming as very connected, as a kind of harvest, if you will. So. And I should say my dad, he was a dairy farmer for 30 years. And so his poems are about that experience of being a dairy farmer and deciding, I should say, to give up the farm and to find a new life in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. So it's not all sorrowful, but I think that poetry is uniquely suited for writing both celebratory moments and grief-filled moments. And my dad
elegies.
And I elegies, absolutely. Yeah. So, right.
That image of the page as a field, right, is something I remember reading that the ancient Greeks. There was a time before it was decided whether you'd write right or left, right, in the Greek language, and for a while, certain modes of writing, it was actually both. You would go across the page from left to right, and then you would turn from right to left, and this is called boostrophon, which means ox turning, right? Is actually the pattern of plowing with an oxen across a page.
That is awesome. I love that. That is something I was not aware of.
Cool. Well, yeah. So that's a potent image.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I feel like maybe this is a good moment to ask you, could you give us a little taste of your verse?
Absolutely. So I'm going to be reading from a collection called Flyover Country. I decided to call this book Flyover Country to kind of critique that term, which I think many of us in the Midwest find offensive. This idea of the Midwest as a place that's merely for flying over. It also has a political element in that I've written a lot about American foreign policy in a critical way, and was thinking about America herself as being a sort of flyover country, carrying out drone strikes abroad and things of that nature. So maybe I'll read a poem that kind of combines the Midwestern subject matter with that more political subject matter. The first poem I'll read is called Cat Moving Kittens. We must have known, even as we reached down to touch them, where we'd found them, shut-eyed and trembling, under a straw bale in the haymow, that she would move them that night under cover of darkness, and that by finding them, we were making certain we wouldn't see them again until we saw them, crouching under the pickup like sullen teens, having gone as wild by then as they'd gone still in her mouth. That night, she made a decision any mother might make upon guessing the intentions of the state, to go and to go now, taking everything you love between your teeth.
Yeah, that's vivid. That's that observation of the cat, the mother cat moving the kittens is very familiar.
Yeah, I think it would be familiar to anyone who's grown up in the country. And the poem came to me because I was remembering this very innocent farm boy experience of looking for the litter of kittens in the haymow. But of course, once you find the kittens, the mother starts to have to move them. And I just, with various things in the news, refugee crisis, things of a political nature, I started to kind of reimagine this scene in a darker way. A lot of my poems celebrate the Midwest, but also kind of critique, I don't want to say critique the experience of finding kittens in the haymow, but sort of complicate these more idyllic ideas. I've many times when I tell people, say in California, that I grew up on a farm, they say, how quaint, how nice. And I always kind of feel a little bit, I chafe against that a little bit. It's a complicated life on the farm. So my poems, I hope speak to that a little.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of Robert Burns' poem about the mice in the field. What's the title of that poem?
I don't remember. I'm being a bad student of poetry here.
Anyway, famous poem. But there is, I think that is certainly something that I see as it's a reason for bringing students into agricultural experiences. It's a rare part. I mean, you probably know the number. It's like 2 or 3% of our population now has some direct involvement with agriculture. And yet it's such a storehouse for our language and for our mental kind of imaginary, that if it's not a primary experience, growing up, it's a person's life is really enriched by experiences with cats and dogs at least, but sheep and chickens and wild animals as well. Our students, a number of them here have become hunters, or at least spent a lot of time in the forest and watch wild animals, but also plants and things in the garden as well.
It's such an important thing. I feel so fortunate to have grown up on a farm. I just remember one night, oftentimes a calf would be born at the precise, wrong time, in the middle of the night. And remember the cow went down after giving birth to this calf. She was down and she was in dire straits, and my dad was dragging the calf back and forth in front of her to kind of show her what she had to live for, more or less. And it's just one of those childhood memories that I'll never, I remember feeling so grateful that I had that experience of seeing life and death, and this very, it was never hidden on the farm. It was, it's right there before your eyes. And especially when you're a kid, those moments are just really, really formative. So I try to speak to that as well in my work, and remember how, it is a unique upbringing. And so I'm very lucky to have grown up there.
Beautiful. Yeah. So you grew up on the farm there in northwestern Iowa.
Illinois,
Illinois.
That's right.
Yeah, close by to Iowa. Those I states nearby.
Sure. Same river.
Right. But there, So one of the things we ask everyone who comes on to Microcollege is to talk a bit about your kind of college years, that period of 18 to 21 years old that we are working with here at the college. What were you doing during that time period? What stands out as really like enriching experiences? What was frustrating? And where were you?
Absolutely. So I had a very, let's say, winding path through undergrad. So I went to a small liberal arts school in central Illinois called Illinois Wesleyan. I was a runner. I went down there to run cross country and track. What happened, though, was that I encountered this amazing poetry teacher who is now one of my best friends. I saw him the other day, in fact, named Michael Tooney, and in a poetry class with him, I was kind of reminded of my love for poetry, which I had let wane in high school because it wasn't cool. Mm-hmm. And the Illinois Wesleyan was a small enough school that there was an English house, and I actually had the experience of like hanging out on the porch with the faculty and getting to know them in such a personal way. That's one of the benefits of a smaller school, right? But I became a little restless there. I changed my major. I decided to spend some time at the Biosphere 2 Institute outside Tucson, Arizona, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a really interesting program. And that was a really in-depth kind of field-based environmental studies program that I did for a semester. I went to India for 7 months to study abroad and travel. I ultimately transferred to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which in retrospect was a bit of a mistake in that I was a transfer student in a huge university, no more English house, no more professors who know you by your first name, big lectures. I felt a little bit lost in the mix at Madison. It was probably a little too late in my academic career to transfer into a new place. So when I look back in retrospect, I think the most fruitful time for me as an undergrad were those experiences where I felt held by a smaller community, whether it was at the English House or at the Biosphere 2 Institute. And yeah, those moments I think were where I felt most connected and most supported. Whereas when I was in a big lecture hall with a teaching assistant, I felt a little lost and a little less invested in my education. So
at the Biosphere 2, were you doing things related to English and writing?
It was a very interesting program in that we didn't actually live inside of what is called the Biodome. If you've ever seen the Pauly Shore movie, it's pretty funny. But there was at the time a program through Columbia University in New York City that was an environmental studies program, but there was a writing aspect to it as well. We were obviously in Arizona, so we were learning a lot about like riparian habitat and the culture and history of southern Arizona, which was completely different. I'd never really been anywhere but the Midwest prior to that. And it was a small group of students and a really, really awesome group of faculty. I remember there were nights where they would gather and play music for us, and we would go camping with them, and we'd go on a lot of like day trips with the faculty, and they took us to the Grand Canyon, and it was extremely intimate and connected group And part of it probably was the very last semester before they closed the program. So
wow.
I feel like there was a feeling of sort of nostalgia even baked into that experience. But yeah, a very formative time for me. Yeah, it was just what I needed at that time as an undergrad.
Microcollege is recorded in the broadcast studios of WDRT Viroqua 91.9 FM Driftless Community Radio on Main Street in Viroqua, Wisconsin. Thanks to Jim and all the folks at WDRT for the support of Thoreau College and the Microcollege podcast.
Yeah, do you, either Wesleyan or at UW-Madison, I mean, the experience of being from a farm or from a small town, coming into some more of a cosmopolitan context, into a university or a larger town, a larger city, it's one of the kind of the classic experiences of the modern world, right? I wonder, what was that experience like for you?
That's a very good question, because I think many of us who grow up on a farm, I mean, my parents were unique in that they really encouraged us to leave the farm. So my dad never encouraged my brothers and I. I have two brothers. One is a surgeon and one's a lawyer, and I became a poet. So
it's one in every family.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. So we were kind of encouraged to make lives off the farm, and so I kind of felt this sense of I wanted to have these experiences, like these broader experiences. I wanted to live in a city. I wanted to do all these things that felt very exciting and foreign to me. But when you've grown up in the country, it never leaves you. And so I was always called back to the Midwest. And I think it was a really nice mix, actually, when I look back on it, this desire to grow and then this rootedness as well in where I come from. And this kind of oscillation between leaving and returning, which I've continued as an adult with my time in California, but always coming back here. Now I think I'm pretty much here for good, so that's great. At some point you just make a home somewhere. But I'm interested in that idea of, the basically yearning for something, but also having this rootedness in where one came from. I think that's a nice dynamic.
So the muse kept speaking to you. How was it that you decided to continue for a while in an academic track and end up being a teacher?
Yeah, that happened. I can't say necessarily by choice, because I think my apprenticeship in poetry, which began when I was a kid, watching my dad give poetry readings and meeting poets who would come visit him, just continued on. I went to 2 graduate programs for poetry. To be honest, to be brutally honest, I had a lot of undergraduate loans, and I needed to defer them, and I also needed some health insurance, and I didn't know what else to do. I went to graduate school right around the time of the financial crisis, and it was a really wonderful, supportive atmosphere. I did a 2-year program at the University of California, Davis, and then I did another 2-year program at the University of Virginia. And to have those, total of 4 years to really focus on my work and to be supported by an academic institution, but in a smaller, in a graduate program, you're in the smaller cohort. And so I found that really positive as well. So I was basically just striving so hard to be a poet that I just kind of kept that going all the way through receiving a fellowship at Stanford, which turned into my lectureship that I've held for about 8 years now. And I love teaching. And I think that my time as a student, I had an idea for what I wanted my education to be, and as a teacher, I was able to kind of offer that to the students in a sense. So it was almost like a kind of paying back, and I enjoyed that process of becoming a teacher after having been a student for honestly so long.
Yeah. So certainly one of the reasons we were interested in talking with you here on the podcast was your experience at Stanford. And we've framed what we're doing on the podcast, and also to a certain degree at Thoreau College, part of it is a critique of the system as it exists. And we haven't talked a lot about that really in much of our previous episodes, a little bit through people's biographies, but by and large, we've been talking about people's projects, what we're doing at Thoreau College and elsewhere, other people's projects. But I guess I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on this time in a major kind of elite institution of higher education in the humanities. What do you see there? About the state of our culture and about the way that higher education is working.
Yeah, so it's been really interesting, being at Stanford, having the privilege of teaching there and having a job that I know many of my friends and colleagues at other institutions feel is kind of the cream of the crop, really, to be teaching at an institution like Stanford. For me, Stanford is unique in that it is a school that is is literally in Silicon Valley. And so some of the principles of the university, I think, are aligned more with that part of our culture.
With a business, a corporate kind of
business, corporate tech.
Yep.
And yet, one thing that I think is a little frustrating for me is that Stanford purports to be this very a school that cares very deeply about the humanities. Unfortunately, those of us who do care about the humanities there feel quite beleaguered. Mm-hmm. I was a lecturer living in the Bay Area. It's very, very difficult to make a living off of the lecturer salary, and to have this passion for teaching the humanities at a place where one does not feel exactly valued by the institution was a constant source of frustration. Unfortunately, it actually impacts how we teach. I'm not saying this just for myself. There is a decline in morale across the higher ed spectrum. There is as you know, a kind of divide between the tenured faculty at certain schools and those of us who are coming up now in higher ed, who are really struggling as adjuncts or lecturers. And it's a shame, because we were the ones at Stanford who had the most interaction with the undergraduate community. The tenured faculty teaches less, they're less involved. Mm-hmm. And so it makes this very strange dynamic. I mean, the very thing I loved about the English house at Illinois Wesleyan was that connection I felt to faculty who at Wesleyan were tenured faculty. And, I found that at that school, and I think that I've always desired that dynamic. But to not see it supported at a school that has so many resources mm-hmm. was just a constant source of frustration for me. So I hope that gets at some dynamic mm-hmm. of feeling. The only word I can think of is beleaguered. Mm-hmm. Feeling like we have this mission and we're called to teach our passion, and mine is poetry. But to see how difficult it is to kind of maintain that passion in a working career, we ended up getting very, very demoralizing, honestly. So, yeah.
One of the things that's important to me as an educator, and as working to establish something like Thoreau College, is to make explicit to myself, at least, and to everyone that we're working with, is I think education really has to have an explicit theory of what a human being is, an anthropology of some kind, right? About human development, about what it is to lead a fulfilled and human life, a system of values, you could say. I'm wondering if explicitly or implicitly, could you say in the institution that you were in there, what is the theory of the human being? What's the anthropology that is being expressed there?
So I think that. And I don't want to speak too critically, but I feel Stanford maybe pays some lip service to the idea of the fully rounded undergraduate who comes through. They have a great books program. They have a humanities center. There's a lot of amazing things that happen there. But if I had $1 for every student who came to my office and said, I really love your class. I want to be a poet, but I'm computer science because I feel such pressure. And that's a particularly high pressure place.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those students are being fed right into, like, it's interesting if you haven't been to Stanford, downtown Palo Alto, the main street is University Avenue, and it literally leads into Palm Drive, which is the drive that leads into Stanford. So there's almost a literal
conveyor
belt, if you will. And the saddest thing was that, I studied I mentioned earlier, my brother became a surgeon. I had originally been a pre-med major, which is laughable now when I think of that. But I just encountered this teacher who reminded me of what I was passionate about it. And I decided to go into this world and this life. And I don't know that the culture of that particular institution, Stanford, supports students who might make that maybe rarer life path. It's not that they don't want to. I just don't know that they feel as supported in that as they might. I feel like I'm wandering a little bit in my answer here, but
it was a hard question.
I'm trying to be fair as well because I do want to acknowledge that it is a supportive place in many ways, but in others I just felt a kind of constant sense of grief when I was teaching, because I would have these great students who were clearly deeply invested in this life in the humanities, but at the last minute they would take that familiar turn towards, and I'm not disparaging STEM fields or tech, but it just felt like more often than not, students were not finding the encouragement to pursue that path. So.
Do you have a sense of why was the institution offering poetry classes at all?
Yeah, very good question.
I asked that because part of my undergraduate education was in Eastern Europe. It was an American liberal arts college, the American University in Bulgaria. But it was very countercultural in that place in the sense that it was doing liberal arts, right? Much of the world has no such idea, right? And I spent my time as a student spending a lot of time explaining to other students why they might have to take a literature class or a history class. It made sense to me but it was culturally specific. But most part of the world, they wouldn't ask a person who's going to be in computer science or pre-med or whatever to take a poetry class or even offer them that opportunity, honestly.
Right. This is the thing, is that the creative writing department at Stanford is the largest department for student enrollment at the university. Now, this is the problem, though, is that a lot of students, I learned one year that students called creative writing classes fuzzy classes, which I had never heard before. That created, let's just say, I lost it. I went completely ballistic in class because I don't think there's anything fuzzy about studying poetry. So there's an idea that these are easy classes, that they're kind of easy credits. I have a lot of athletes. I have a lot of seniors, and they say that they wanted to take a poetry class before they graduate and go work for Facebook. That to me is the problem, right? Is that they should not be seeing the class as this thing that they can kind of like, just one last little fun class before I graduate. It should be worked in such a way that it feels interwoven with their, I have no problem with them being computer science majors, but I did have a problem feeling like what I was so passionate about was to them just this kind of fuzzy thing. And I don't know. I think that the university, to be honest, I think that there are poetry classes because they're popular, but I don't think that they are popular for the right reason, probably. So.
Yeah, maybe could you say if we were to organize things, convince people to think about it differently. So let's say a person is their work is going to be in computer science or in finance or or in medical field, something like that. Like why should poetry be part of their education? Yeah,
so I feel like, to backtrack just really quickly, one reason why we call them fuzzy classes is harder to quantify, right? It's harder to quantify how they do in these classes. And therefore, I constantly got questions about how am I going to be graded? And what I'm looking for is improvement and effort. And frankly, investment in their own. Basically, you're asking them to invest in their own life. Care enough about your own life experiences in your writing to take this seriously, because I can't give that to you. I can't force you to take your own life seriously, which as poets, we're bringing our own life and experience to the page. So you're actually asking them to make this big leap, I feel like. So it's almost like they're not prepared to do that. They've been taught that this is a class in which they receive a grade. There are certain things they have to do to receive that grade. They want to know, what is A work, what is B work? It's really hard to convey to them that A work is when you put a lot of skin in this, where you really you really work to make this poem as strong as possible because you care about it, So again, I feel like I'm wandering a little bit, but I think that is the essential issue, is that they come to classes with a kind of quantitative framework in mind. And this is just a completely different, we're coming at it from a completely different angle. And at a school like Stanford is particularly hard, but I would imagine it would be hard at any institution, really.
The Driftless Folk School, located in the beautiful rolling hills and valleys of southwest Wisconsin, is a community of lifelong learners dedicated to cultivating personal and cultural resilience through hands-on educational experiences. The Driftless Folk School offers classes in agriculture, land stewardship, natural history, folk arts and crafts, herbalism, wilderness skills, and more. For further information on the Driftless Folk School, visit us at driftlessfolkschool.org on the World Wide Web.
Those elite institutions have their own sets of issues, it does seem. Are you familiar with the thesis of William Dershowitz, The Excellent Sheep?
I've heard of this writer, but no, I'm not.
Well, so he was a professor, a literature professor at Yale, and his book really is an observation of students who are going through not just Yale, but the kind of systems that lead a student, the majority of students, these kind of very hyper competitive, very like output kind of driven institutions. And what he finds them is to be very risk averse, right? Yep. That they are, the incentives are very clear. They're very strong. They certainly know how to work on the classes that have a strong payoff. But they for literature professor, and you could say a person concerned about the inner life and about like the ethical and like the qualitative quality of our civilization, it's really concerning, right? Because these people are the people who will run the world, right? Who do run the world, and if they are only quantitative, right, and they know how to operate an algorithm, right, which is how to get a good grade in a Stanford class, then that's quite different from creating things that are like good, beautiful, and true.
Yeah, and I don't want to fall into the tired critique of like tech because no one reads anymore. And I do think that there is an issue with attention span and focus. But I had a student once come to me and say, I'm working on an app to identify the moment of highest suspense in, say, an Edgar Allan Poe story. And I said to the student, well, I can show you the moment of highest suspense. It's what you're doing here is sort of not that interesting. But so yeah, I definitely feel that they are very, very, very smart, extremely smart. But there are other aspects of their, I guess you could say, development that I feel are atrophying a little bit because of the focus on those smarts and what you described as being they're basically very adept at certain things, and that's great, but it's almost like someone with like a huge bicep and really small tricep or something. There's an imbalance of muscle.
Yeah. Yeah, so that for me that's certainly something I appreciate about Deep Springs and of that type of education, which is not just intellectual, especially for the young person, as I certainly was, who was oriented towards the intellectual. Right, and the students who end up at Deep Springs are that kind of student. They're selected for their ability to write and for their verbal kind of capacity, their scores and things like that, and it puts them into an environment where they're not only having to do that. Right, they're having to work with cows
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
with like rusty old machinery and with each other, actually,
Yeah.
decision making in very complex kind of moral and practical decision making. And I think that is really built into the pedagogy and really the theory of the human being, the anthropology that expressed in Deep Springs and in institutions like Thoreau College, where we are you're asking people to do things that are across the spectrum, all of which are challenging, all of which are complex. Yeah. And my hope is that every student is challenged every day in some different part of themselves here.
That's so awesome, because my favorite class at Stanford that I taught was a nature writing class. And one thing we did would take a field trip to the coast to a friend's farm, and they would help on the farm. And then we would go to this cave on the coast, and I would say, build a fire. And it was amazing, to watch them try to work together to build a fire, which many of them just didn't know how to do. And I didn't help them with it. They had to figure it out. I think they gleefully burned some of the papers that I had handed out earlier in the semester.
Paper, yeah.
Yeah. But it was just, many of them had never even been out to the coast. They didn't get off of campus. They just didn't have a lot of opportunities to just like flex other muscle. That's the metaphor that's coming to mind, I guess, is that they just didn't have those opportunities. And I was really trying so hard in an institution that maybe is not set up for the kind of education that I admire so much about Thoreau College and Black Mountain and Deep Springs. I was trying to bring some of that in there, and I'm proud of that. But I think ultimately it's, maybe the institution is just not shaped for that. I that seems a little pessimistic to say, but I'm increasingly more interested in schools that are basically oriented that way from the jump. So
for me it is important. I do think these students who are going to Stanford and institutions like that are consequential in our world in outsized kind of ways. So for them, I think it's especially important for people to have those. It's important for everyone to have this variety of experience, but it's really noticeable when it's out of balance in that way. I'm wondering, as you've talked about how important and given us an example of how important your farm experiences are for your poetry. I'm wondering what you found for, I'm assuming the majority of your students who didn't have that kind of experience. Like what are they making poetry out of? Where is their language coming from?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. Last time I taught poetry, well, I'm teaching it technically right now, but in the spring I had a very strange number of students from rural places. We were laughing. I had students from Nebraska, rural Idaho, somewhere out east that was rural, and their poems were... I don't know. I'm probably biased whenever I see like a combine in a poem. I just love it. I'm like, this is a great poem. It doesn't really matter how good the poem is. There's a combine in it. But there was some quality. I mean, I hesitate to put it this way, but they seem to have a larger wealth of imagery and experience to draw from. And, I don't want to imply that by not growing up on a farm, you therefore couldn't become a good poet. That's absolutely not true, and obviously not true. But they seemed more fully developed in their life experiences and their basically storehouse of imagery that they could draw from than students who had grown up in other places where maybe they hadn't had those experiences as much.
Well, it's striking. It seems like you were at least sometimes trying to create opportunities for people, like how to start a fire in a cave by the sea. Right. I did.
There's a student farm at Stanford that's really interesting, and we would go to the student farm and do some writing exercises there. I would bring them to the art museum. I was just trying to the arboretum. Even the founders of Stanford are morbidly buried on the campus. They're in a mausoleum on the campus. And this is my probably most unpopular exercise, but I would bring my poetry students to the mausoleum and say, write an elegy for the founders of your university. Because Stanford University is an interesting story in that it's named after the son of Leland Stanford and Jane Stanford. His name was Leland Stanford Jr. He died as a boy in Italy. And so the whole school is like this memorial to this boy. And I think there's such a story in that, so I was trying to get the students to see they're living in this kind of story, by being there. But it was a struggle. And that was, I admit, a strange exercise. Yeah.
So your teaching time there at Stanford encompassed the period before COVID and during COVID and up to the present day. Remotely you're teaching a bit now. And I'm wondering, do you have observations about the how the students that you're working with, how the experience of teaching has evolved through that sequence of history?
Well, it's not. Yeah, it's been very, very strange. And I think one could say across the board that we are finding that it's been a really, really difficult time for students. I think that COVID has deeply affected higher ed, and not just the student body, but the teachers as well. The move to online learning in poetry classes was actually maybe not as disruptive as it might be for, say, like a biology lab. I think that we could transition to that kind of remote learning pretty easily. And I'm teaching online currently. I'll teach online later today. But something is lost. I read, I think I maybe mentioned it to you, a New York Times editorial about the effects of maybe COVID upon higher ed. And a teacher had the observation that discussion was so disappointing that she almost wondered whether the students were even aware that they were in person again, which sounds really strange. But I do sometimes think that the students almost even in person look a little bit like they're still on Zoom or something. There's maybe a little bit of a loss of just the basic interaction and discussion. I had many classes this past year where I really struggled to get students to engage. They just seemed a little reluctant to lean in and say something. And that was not something that I had ever experienced at Stanford before, because Stanford students are usually so verbose.
Yeah, there's a social muscle which is atrophied, and I think not just students, but many people in the world right now.
Yeah, I can't blame them for it.
I had the experience of being kind of physically flat out on my back for a couple of months last year, and it was striking how fast physical muscle atrophies, right? It took a while to learn how to walk normally, like a while. And I think you could see this in our whole society on a social level. Just the ability to have a conversation, to not talk over each other, and then not to and to just space things out and just to know what to say. And I think that shows up so vividly in the classroom conversation.
That's so, I feel I try to connect with the students on this. I try to say, it's not equivalent, but my 10th day of college was 9/11. And I just remember, starting off as a freshman and basically watching the news. That was, we were told to go home and watch the news by a teacher that, I was in that class that morning. So it's kind of trying to tell the students now they had not been born at the time,
right? But
that these things happen sometimes as when you're a student, and I'm sympathetic to this, but one thing I'll say is I worry that as teachers we might be not holding students responsible for really doing what one has to do in a class. Like I feel at times I was a little bit too accommodating, and therefore students kind of lost the quality of education that I wanted to give them. In other words, what I'm trying to say is maybe I could have been a little bit stricter and a little bit less accommodating, despite the very, very understandable challenges.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Okay. It's certainly something I wrestled with as well. There is this balance, between what you're saying. This is, understanding the value of challenge, of rigor, of facing difficulty, of pushing through those moments of challenge, and then an awareness of the real catastrophic kind of mental health situation that we are in.
Absolutely.
Students and everybody in our society, and what is the role of a academic teacher, poetry teacher, or whatever, or an institution in that role.
Gosh, and it really comes down to what is my intention? Is it to punish the student? I had a student who basically didn't come to class the entire quarter, but because I was being so accommodating, I gave them a decent grade ultimately because I just didn't want to punish the student. But what I felt ultimately just bad for them that they didn't have the experience of the class. They just missed the whole class, and they got their grade, but to me it was just like a failure on all sides, and I don't know what to say about that. I don't know how I feel about it. I could have really held the student to account and made them come to class or else get a bad grade, but I don't know what that would have done either. So it's a really hard time. It's definitely a very difficult time right now to navigate.
Yeah. So that brings me, one thing that you haven't mentioned about your biography and is important to the context of microcolleges is you've had experiences in living in like an intentional community. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and then what you took away from that?
Yeah, so I numerous times in my life I've found myself in community. I lived in a really interesting housing cooperative when I was a graduate student at Davis on campus. And so it was all students, and we had gardens and we had chickens, and it was just an amazing experience. I got more out of that experience, honestly, than I did from my graduate classes in poetry. It was very fruitful. And then I became very interested in this community in Missouri called the Possibility Alliance and spent some time there. I've also had some experiences with the Catholic worker community. And this is obviously my interest in farming, but I'm really interested in basically different ways of attaining knowledge and conveying knowledge, maybe outside of the traditional academic context. So like workshops and, ways that we still shared a lot of writing and intellectual work on the farm that I was living on in Missouri. These are not like, it's not like you have to choose between like an intellectual life and a life that's focused more on living on the land. I'm really interested in communities that combine those two. I think the Catholic worker movement is a really good example of a community that strives to marry a life of the intellect and the spirit with a life of labor on the land. So that to me has always been a kind of ideal that I strive for.
Yeah, that's a golden example. Yeah, it's an ideal that goes back to the monastic communities in the Middle Ages and far beyond that, right? Yeah. That's a trade-off of, if you being connected with the land and a life of the mind and being separated. If there's a way that cannot be true. That's really beautiful.
Absolutely. And I see that in Thoreau and in both the college and in the writer. I meant the writer in that instance. But it's true of both. And one of my heroes is Thomas Merton, the great Trappist monk, kind of a radical writer monk in the 1960s. And I just visited the monastery where he lived in Kentucky. And just reading his journals, just the almost seamless flow between the work of the monastery and his spiritual and intellectual and contemplative life. Like, to me, that is really what I aspire towards as a writer myself. So.
Thoreau College is a leader in an emergent movement dedicated to the renewal and revitalization of higher education through the creation of new, humanly scaled institutions with holistic curricula known as microcolleges. Thoreau College, higher education for the whole human being.
So your Stanford students, and what degree does, let's say, the spiritual or like this explicit interior experience or spiritual experience, to what degree did that enter into their poetry and their work with you?
Oh, that's a great question as well. The students who I most resonate with are the students who tend to have some kind of a sense or a life of the spirit as well. And I don't bring my own spiritual life very much into the classroom because I don't feel that comfortable doing that. But for instance, I can truly say the best student I ever had at Stanford, I'm going to see her this weekend in Chicago. She's now at Chicago Divinity School. I just knew, like, she was teaching me more than I was teaching her when she was my student. Like, I just knew that there was something about Emily. And now she's gone on to be an expert on the work of Simone Weil, and she's doing just amazing work at University of Chicago. I don't think I would have connected with her had it not been for these other shared interests that we had, that we were able to connect with. Honestly, in office hours is where I would find the students who I most loved, because they would come to see me and I could open up a little more and say, hey, have you read? It sounds like you're interested in this and that. And in a way that I wasn't as comfortable in a 15 student classroom. So.
I mean, I've been a high school teacher for approaching 2 decades now, or working with, and in that time period, I've observed there's a noticeable, there's a generational change that has happened, and more students, I'm finding, have had no relationship to a religion or a spiritual practice at all. Previously, most of them had experiences of parents who had grown up Catholic, traditionally Jewish, Lutheran, whatever. And then the parents had at some point in their youth dropped away, rejected that in some way. So they had that sort of negative image. We're I think, in the next generation where people just don't even have that negative relationship. And that it puts them in a really interesting space, right? I find, there's a lot of curiosity, but a curiosity from a position of really no background at all.
Yeah. It's so interesting that it's not negative; it's neutral.
Actually, yeah. I mean, so I, just as an example of what that looks like, I remember, I've taught history of religions and things like that in high school. I remember bringing, in the early years, back in the mid 2000s, taking students on field trips and going into a church, let's say a Catholic church with the statue of the Virgin Mary, some windows there, and the students having kind of a really negative reaction to that explicitly religious environment.
Yeah.
So fast forward 10 years later. 12 years later, you take a group of students into the same space and they're like, wow, that's really cool looking. They've never seen it before, right? That's noteworthy, kind of a change.
That's so interesting. There's a great teacher of art history at Stanford named Alex Nemerov, and he's the son of a really great poet named Howard Nemerov, actually. But Alex's classes are obviously art history. I mean, you have to have a sense of what these iconographic devotional paintings are about, for you to really understand
in particular,
them. Yeah. So I don't know, I haven't talked to him about this, but you're probably having to do double duty and teach a little bit of religious history as this is the Virgin Mary, and I'm not saying that students aren't aware of that, but I feel like there's some of that knowledge has fallen away.
The very thinnest kind of veneer, even for people who are so-called, supposedly churchgoers or anything like that.
Right. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. I guess I'm wondering, you are people coming to poetry seeking spiritual experiences or finding them there?
Okay. So let me see if I can say this in a... I am constantly trying to divest my students of the notion that poetry is... about, this is going to sound very cliche, but expressing the self or some particular political angle. I mean, I did just read a political poem with the cat moving kittens poem, but I like to think that I came to the political obliquely. And John Keats, the poet, said that we dislike any art that has a palpable design upon us. And I'm constantly trying to teach the students that a poem is not kind of like an essay. It doesn't have, it's not an op-ed. So yeah, I don't know that they come to it with any kind of spiritual framework, but I do think that they come to it with a kind of sense that this is the way that they're going to convey their political or personal belief system. And I personally don't think that that's best suited for poems, but so
there's certain genre of poetry where that's what it is. But you could write national anthems or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm trying to show them poems that do something slightly different. And
well, since you've brought up politics, something that out here in the provinces I hear from students who've been in the culture, but especially at college campuses, is that is a sense of the overwhelming presence of political questions, to the degree that I've heard multiple young people tell me that they really have to guard very closely what they say, how they express themselves, and that there is an atmosphere of self-censorship on campuses. And I'm wondering if you have any observations of that dimension.
Yeah, I think I felt that a little bit myself, just as a teacher, that my politics are quite radical, I feel, but I definitely felt at times there were certain poems that I couldn't teach. Students didn't seem to have as much a sense that a poem is a kind of, I think of a poem as almost a performance. Like there's a quality almost of artifice about it. So I was constantly trying to tell them, the poet is different from the speaker of the poem. Like, yeah, this is the name of the poet, but the speaker of the poem can be doing this very different thing. Maybe they're being sarcastic. Maybe they're trying to challenge you in some particular way. And I felt like they were not able to make that division very easily, kind of yoking the poet to the poem. So it's not answering your question, but in their own work, I felt that times there's a kind of superficial morality that I would see in the poems where I didn't feel like they were really digging down into the complexities of an issue, which is, poems are uniquely suited to do that. So, but I've definitely, heard from students the same thing. So, yeah.
But it's interesting, the poem that you read for us just a few minutes ago, you gave us a little gloss, an interpretation of it before, which gave it a political context, which made sense hearing the poem. But without that gloss, you can see that it would be a very powerful poem, but you might put it into a different context, right? There's a whole kind of a metaphysical kind of a set of relationships that are being expressed there through this very concrete images that could be political, but it could be something quite different than that too.
Yeah, hopefully we're leaving room, because I tell my students you can't follow your poems into the world. You can't constantly be next to them, explaining them to people. They have to stand for themselves and speak for themselves. So, and that's the joy of it, is that, people, they are hopefully open to interpretation. So I almost feel strange glossing the poem myself, offering it some context, because I would
It's your last chance. You send it out in the world.
Yeah, that's right. I felt weird if I had just read it and just been completely silent. So it's probably my own.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, on that, do you have another poem for us?
I do, yeah, sure.
That'd be delightful.
I think I might read a poem called Country Things, which is about something we were talking about earlier, like the compromises maybe that one has to make living in the country, like the fact that it's not all just idyllic. There's like this other dimension to it, this darkness that I think is what makes it so valuable. So there's my gloss for it. Country Things. Some days even nature seems sinister. Walking around the farm with a beer, seeking some solace after the evening news, you meet the cat you love, coming back from the windbreak, a rare songbird in his mouth. In the mulberry branches, the silkworms writhe in nests that, backlit by twilight, look like x-rays of lungs. In the pasture, the cow kicks at her calf and won't let her nurse, while in a seam of gleaming honey in the oak that lightning cleaved, the queen daintily eats her offspring. In the rafters of the barn, the starlings are pushing the owl's eggs out of the nest, while the owl herself is out hunting. Going in, you nearly step on a swarm of ants ravishing a butterfly, like pirates tearing a capsized ship down, its wings like torn sails. And the first thing you hear when you enter the kitchen is the snap of the mousetrap you set this morning, tired of being kept awake all night by their scratching in the walls. And so you are met with your own small act of cruelty, your contribution to the whole. With a pair of pliers that are themselves always biting something, you take the broke-necked mouse by the tail and throw it into the darkening yard, never knowing that in favor of it, the cat let go of the bird, who was only stunned, and whose song you woke to this morning.
Goosebumps there.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to write a poem about all the violence of the natural world, but to offer a little bit of resurrection there at the end with the bird that goes free and who we wake to. So.
Yeah. Wow. There's only a few times in my teaching at the high school level that I taught poetry, but I think enough to think about why would you do poetry. But the favorite definition that I was brought to class was from Robert Graves,
I love him.
from the White Goddess, who says
sure.
that the definition of poetry is any organization of words that causes the hair to stand up in the back of your arm.
Very good. Or Emily Dickinson, the poem that makes you feel like the top of your head has been taken off.
Right. That's
so I would tell the students this is what you should feel. If, if it's that's the kind of goal.
So you've made a choice to leave the academy, and to move back to the Midwest. Can you talk about that? How did that come about?
Yeah, so I felt that my life had split, and I was teaching, but not teaching with my full heart. I was becoming less and less invested in the students. I was becoming resentful of the students at times, which was a horrible feeling, really resentful of the institution. Just the wealth, and particularly at Stanford and Silicon Valley, but in the whole Bay Area, while trying to make a living as a lecturer, was just becoming this source of great bitterness, and I didn't want to feel bitter any longer. And I've loved Viroqua for years now. I've come up here mostly to do some fly fishing and just to enjoy the driftless landscape. And my parents live down near Spring Green, and I had the opportunity to start working at Organic Valley. But the real reason, I think, is to root myself in the Midwest, which is where my work is rooted, and to not feel this kind of cleaving in half all the time between my life as it was out there and kind of the archetypal sort of world that I try to draw from in my work. So that sounds a little bit highfalutin, but I feel I wanted to unify my life a little bit by coming back. And I am going to miss teaching. Like, this is my last week of teaching this week, and I'm feeling very, very upset about leaving the students because I did care so much about teaching. So I don't think I'm done for good. I think I just needed to do something different. So
So does teaching play an essential role in your work as your own creative process?
I think it does, because I taught out of the same, it came from the same well that the work does. That could be very exhausting too. I felt often that I wasn't writing as well or as much because I was giving of myself so much to the students, and it felt almost like a kind of martyrdom. I'm interested to see what it's going to be like to do a job that doesn't draw from that well, and to see whether I might have more for my own work. But I'm not sure yet. So it could turn out that I find that I really miss that engagement with teaching, writing. So we'll see. It's kind of yet to be determined. Yeah,
that seems like that's a common observation that teaching and writing are part of the same psychic complex. Certainly, I've experienced it, at our institutions I've been involved with, that the people who are writers sometimes stop being teachers because I can't write while I'm teaching.
And vice versa.
And vice versa,
Teachers
right?
stop being writers. Also, to be honest, like spending a lot of time with other people's words. I'm like a sponge, and I'm not going to say that it like negatively influenced my writing, but it almost like blocked, in a way, like having other work in my head blocked my own work at times. So I would write more in like breaks, and unfortunately as a lecturer I'm teaching, like that's why I'm teaching this summer.
Right.
You end up teaching all the time.
Now you can't even go out of town and stuff.
You still have to work. So so
well, beautiful. Austin, thank you so much for spending some time with us here today. Thank you for moving here to Viroqua.
It was a
to have you here.
And it is a pleasure. And thanks so much, Jacob, for inviting me on.
I understand that you will have a podcast of your own soon.
Yes, I wanted to mention that on Friday mornings at 9:30, I'm going to have a podcast called Poet's Table.
You're on WDRT in Viroqua if you're in the area, or you can stream it on the internet.
That's right. And we're going to be starting that in September. And it's just a celebration of a particular poet each show. So I'll be sharing some poems by that poet and talking a little bit about their life and work.
Cool. Look forward to that. Thank you, Austin.
Thank you so much.